The lock to apartment 4B had always been stubborn, a heavy brass mechanism that required you to lift the handle exactly 3 millimeters while turning the key counterclockwise. I hadn't forgotten the trick. Even after 8 months, 2 weeks, and 4 days of survival rations and dust storms in North Africa, my fingers remembered the precise weight of the door. It was 11:43 on a Tuesday night. The hallway smelled exactly the same, a faint mix of old carpet, the neighbor's lavender floor cleaner, and the heavy, humid air of a Richmond July. I stood there for a full 10 seconds, the weight of my canvas duffel bag digging into my left collarbone. My boots were ruined. The desert dust was baked into the seams of the leather, leaving light tan rings around the heels that no brush would ever completely remove. I had a stupid, irrational lump in my throat because I was 19 days early, and for the last 48 hours of travel, I had been nurturing the ridiculous hope that I might finally be the one to surprise someone, instead of being the guy who gets a letter 3 weeks late. The living room was dark. The only illumination came from the kitchen, where the low fluorescent bulb over the sink cast a pale, buttery rectangle across the linoleum floor. But the first thing that made me stop the detail that pulled my shoulders tight and made my heart alter its rhythm was my bedroom door. It was wide open. My name is Ethan Ward. I'm 29 years old, and as an Army combat medic, I had spent the last 8 months training my central nervous system to sleep light enough to wake up if a breeze shifted a tent flap 3 yards away. When you live in a constant state of calculated tension, your body doesn't understand the concept of home just because you crossed an ocean. Before my brain could even process why the door was open, my knees bent slightly. My breathing went flat, shallow, and perfectly silent. Then, through the darkness of the hallway, I heard a voice. "No, no, no," she whispered, her voice carrying that slight, raspy edge it always got when she had been awake for more than 16 hours. "This looks insane. You look insane, Tessa." "Look," Tessa Collins, my roommate, my emergency contact, the woman whose name was scribbled on a piece of grease-stained cardboard inside my left breast pocket, right next to my blood type. For 8 months, I had performed a very specific, highly disciplined ritual of pretending I didn't miss her more than a decent cup of black coffee. She was 28, worked the night shift in the emergency room at VCU Health, and possessed the kind of face that made strangers in the cereal aisle tell her about their divorces. She also had a mouth sharp enough to cut zip ties, a trait I respected deeply, considering zip ties had been a recurring problem in my line of work. I should have cleared my throat. A mature, well-adjusted, 29-year-old man who had survived mortar fire would have said, "Hey, Tess, I'm back." Instead, the combat medic instinct faded, and the suspicious raccoon instinct took over. I drifted down the short hallway, my boots making no sound on the worn rug, my duffel bag balanced perfectly so the metal buckles wouldn't clink. When I reached the threshold of my room, I stopped. It didn't look like the room I had left in November. The mattress wasn't bare. It was made up with clean, crisp navy sheets I'd never seen before, pulled tight at the corners with hospital precision. The small amber lamp on my nightstand was glowing, casting long, soft shadows across the floorboards. My old Richmond Flying Squirrels baseball cap, which I'd left abandoned on top of the dresser, sat exactly where it belonged, but the thin layer of gray dust was gone. Someone had dusted around it. In the middle of the room stood Tessa. She was wearing my old, oversized gray army hoodie, the one with the frayed cuffs, and the faint grease stain from when I fixed the kitchen sink in 2024. The hem reached her mid-thighs. Her dark hair was twisted up into a messy, structural impossibility held together by a single blue ink pen. One of her thick wool socks was sliding halfway off her left heel, bunching up under her arch. In her right hand, she held a folded piece of paper. Spread across the navy comforter was a neat, chronological stack of envelopes, each one labeled with a date in her sharp, slanted handwriting. She had her left hand pressed tightly over her mouth, staring down at the paper like it was a medical chart she couldn't decipher. I leaned my shoulder against the doorframe, keeping my arms loose. "Please tell me you're not selling my identity," I said quietly. Tessa spun around so fast her hip clipped the corner of my dresser. The wooden frame groaned, and the folded letter slipped from her fingers, drifting through the air before landing silently on the rug between us. Her eyes, already wide from exhaustion, went completely round. For one long, agonizing second, the only sound in the apartment was the hum of the old refrigerator in the kitchen and the ragged catch of her breath. She looked at me at the uniform, the dust on my collar, the 19 days early reality of my presence, and then her gaze dropped to the floor. You weren't supposed to see this, she whispered. Her voice was very soft, devoid of the usual sharp wit she used as armor. I had heard those exact words in a lot of bad situations over the years. Usually, they were uttered by a private covered in transmission fluid, a lieutenant trying to explain why a goat was inside a government vehicle, or a supply clerk standing next to an empty crate. But coming from Tessa, standing in my bedroom while drowning in my own clothes, those 6 words did something significantly worse than scare me. They made my heart trip over itself and lose its footing completely. I let my duffel bag slide off my shoulder. It hit the floor with a heavy, dead thud. I came home early, I said, my voice sounding rougher than I intended. I see that you're in my room. I also see, whatever those are, and you're wearing my hoodie. Tessa looked down at the gray fabric, as if the hoodie had personally betrayed her by existing. She pulled the sleeves down over her hands, her fingers digging into the knit cuffs. It was cold, she muttered defensively. It's July, Tess. The humidity outside is 90%. The air conditioning in this building is aggressive, she shot back, her chin lifting slightly. You know how the vent in the living room blows directly onto the sofa? Anyone. We stood there, 5 feet apart, both of us acting like this was a perfectly normal conversation about building maintenance and not the exact type of high-stakes, fragile moment that people traditionally ruin by either saying way too much or absolutely nothing at all. She dropped to her knees suddenly, her bare heels slipping out of the loose sock as she began gathering the envelopes off the bed. Her movements were too fast, too erratic. You should have texted from the airport or Washington. You usually text when you hit the East Coast. I wanted to surprise you, I said, watching the way her fingers trembled slightly against the paper. Well, she glanced around the room, her cheeks flushing a distinct, brilliant pink under the warm lamplight. Last. Congratulations. You did. I couldn't help it. A small, involuntary smile tugged at the corner of my mouth. Tessa's eyes immediately flicked to my lips, stayed there for less than half a second, and then darted away toward the window. That tiny, subconscious movement hit me harder than any welcome home banner ever could have. Tessa and I had become roommates 18 months ago for 2 reasons. Rent in the historic district of Richmond was an absolute insult to working professionals, and my buddy's sister knew her cousin. Somehow, that tenuous social thread turned into a signed lease agreement. At first, we were just polite strangers sharing cabinet space. I stayed out of her way, she stayed out of mine. Then, she discovered I consistently burned toast when I was coming off a 48-hour shift. I discovered she cried at vintage videos of golden retrievers, but claimed it was a sudden onset of indoor allergies. She started leaving yellow sticky notes on the coffee maker with messages like, "Your creamer expired during the Carter administration," or, "If you leave your boots in the hallway again, I'm going to paint them neon green." In return, I fixed the squeaky hinge on her bathroom door at midnight because she threatened to name the squeak after me and include it in her will. Somewhere along that jagged, ordinary timeline, the apartment stopped feeling like a place where I stored my gear between fields and started feeling like the only place I actually wanted to be. And that was dangerous. The last woman I had loved had mailed my engagement ring back to me while I was stationed in Georgia. She hadn't done it dramatically. There was no screaming match, no long-distance, tearful breakdown. Just a small, bubble-wrapped padded envelope and a note that said she couldn't keep waiting for a life that paused every time the Army called a deployment. So, I had spent the last 3 years teaching myself not to ask for too much from anyone. I had built a very efficient, very sterile wall around the idea of expectations. Then, Tessa happened. She was funny, steady, maddeningly stubborn, and kind in the specific, unvarnished way that forces a man to lower his guard before he even realizes he's dropped his hands. "What are those, Tess?" I asked, nodding toward the stack she was now clutching against her chest like a shield. "Nothing," she said immediately. "Tessa, I'm a medic. My entire job description involves inventory control and documentation. Paperwork has evolved since I left, but I'm pretty sure those are letters." I took one slow step into the room, keeping my posture relaxed, careful not to corner her. The air between us felt heavy, thick with 8 months of unspoken distance. "Were you writing to me?" Her grip on the envelopes tightened until the edges of the top one crinkled. "That depends entirely on how you define the word writing. With a pen. On paper. Usually, words are involved." "Then yes," she said, her voice dropping into a small, defiant whisper. "Technically." "Oh, My throat tightened. I looked at the sheer volume of paper in her arms. There had to be 30 or 40 of them. You never sent them. No. Why? She tried to let out a short, careless laugh, but it came out thin, cracking slightly at the edge. Because I'm not your girlfriend, Ethan. And the room changed. It wasn't a loud shift, not like a door slamming or a shell casing hitting concrete. It felt more like a single match being struck in a very dark, very dry space. I looked at her, really looked at her, standing there in my old hoodie, her eyes dark with exhaustion and her chin tilted up with that brave, defensive stubbornness, and every single feeling I had spent 8 months shoving down into the sand stood up inside me at once. No, I said, my voice dropping an octave as I took another step toward her. You're not. Her shoulders lowered just a fraction, a tiny, miserable sag, as if she had expected that exact answer and already hated herself for caring. I stopped just 2 feet away from her. But I thought about you every single day I was gone. Tessa went perfectly still. The words surprised both of us. I hadn't planned them. I was a man who lived by plans. I mapped out casualty collection points, calculated litter rotation times, and checked expiration dates on chest seals. I did not plan to come home 19 days early and confess my hidden attachments in a dark bedroom while my roommate held a secret archive of my existence. Tessa's fingers white-knuckled the paper. Don't say that. Don't say that, she whispered, her eyes shining under the lamplight. Don't say that just because you just stepped off a plane and everything feels intense and overwhelming. It felt intense in April, Tess, I said, my voice steady. Her mouth parted slightly. And May? I continued, taking the final step until the tips of my dirty combat boots were practically touching her thick wool socks. And June. July was pretty bad, too. She stared at me, her lower lip trembling just enough that she had to bite it to stop the movement. But she recovered enough to arch one dark eyebrow, her defensive humor flaring up like a pilot light. August was nothing special then? I was trying to play it cool in August, I murmured. Didn't want to get ahead of myself. A small, wet laugh escaped her lips. It was a beautiful, reluctant sound, and it almost broke my resolve completely. She looked away, her gaze drifting down toward the bed, toward the letters, toward whatever private truth she had been keeping hidden in the quiet corners of my room while I was thousands of miles away. I was going to put them all back in the closet before you got here, she said softly, her voice thick. And then I was going to make a very casual, very detached dinner for when you walked through the door. Something that said, "Welcome home, platonic person whom I definitely did not miss in a deeply concerning way." What was the dinner? Lasagna. Tess, lasagna isn't casual. It has multiple structural layers. It takes commitment. It was a frozen one, she muttered, though her cheeks were burning brighter now. Still intimate, I said, my voice softening. Warm carbs imply a level of emotional investment. She gave me a long look through her eyelashes. You think frozen pasta is intimate? I've been eating pouch tuna and crackers out of a cardboard box since November, Tess. At this point, a warm carb feels like a marriage proposal. That got a real smile out of her. It was quick, involuntary, and entirely beautiful. Every instinct I had developed over 29 years told me to cross the remaining inches between us. I wanted to touch the edge of her wrist, right where the gray sleeve ended, just to see if she would lean into the contact or pull away into the shadows. I wanted to ask her why she had kept my room glowing like she was waiting for a ghost to return, only to get a dusty, tired soldier instead. But she looked terrified, not of me, but of whatever happened next, of the boundary line we were currently standing on. So I stayed where I was. Can I read one? I asked quietly. Her face changed instantly, her grip tightening on the papers again. No. Okay. The immediate compliance seemed to surprise her. Her shoulders relaxed slightly. Okay? Just like that? You're not going to pull the military rank card on me? They're your words, Tess. They're about me. But they're still yours. If you want them to stay in your head, that's where they stay. Dot. Her eyes softened in a way I had only seen twice before in my life. Once was through a pixelated FaceTime screen when I was sitting on a cot surrounded by sandbags after a particularly brutal week, and she had spent 40 minutes pretending she didn't notice my hands shaking around a paper cup of terrible coffee. Slowly, carefully, she leaned over and set the stack of envelopes back on the center of the navy comforter. You always do that, she murmured, looking down at them. Do what? Make it incredibly difficult to keep my distance from you. The air between us went completely quiet again. The heat of the room seemed to rise, heavy and expectant. Then, as if the universe decided we had spent enough time talking around the edge of things, the top envelope, a pale, slightly textured blue paper, slid off the slick navy comforter. It drifted through the space between us and landed face up, right against the dirty leather toe of my left boot. We both looked down at it. The envelope was pristine, except for my name written across the front in her neat, distinct handwriting, Ethan. But it was the smaller line of text written directly underneath my name, in tiny, hurried cursive, that made my breath stop in my lungs. Open this if Ethan comes home and still looks at me like I'm only his roommate. For a second, the training failed. The medic, who could track a pulse in the dark, forgot how to draw air. Tessa made a tiny, strangled sound, half panic, half total resignation, and bent down quickly to grab the blue paper. I got there first. Not because I was trying to snatch it away from her, but out of pure, unadulterated reflex. The same physical reflex that allowed me to catch falling mugs, dropped scalpels, and bad ideas before they hit the floor. My fingers closed around the cool blue paper, just as hers came down. Instead of grabbing the letter, her palm closed firmly over the top of my wrist. Everything stopped again. Her hand was warm, significantly smaller than mine, her skin slightly rough from the harsh hospital soap she used for 12-hour shifts. Her thumb landed directly over my pulse point, the one that was currently hammering against her skin like a trapped bird, betraying every single bit of military composure I had left. Don't, she whispered. I looked up from the floor. She was close now, close enough that I could see the faint violet shadows under her eyes from her night shifts, the soft, anxious crease between her brows, and the single loose strand of dark hair that had escaped her pen and stuck to the side of her damp cheek. She smelled like lavender detergent, old coffee, and something that was just inherently Tessa. I won't open it, I said, keeping my hand perfectly still beneath hers. Her grip eased slightly, but she didn't let go of my wrist. Her thumb stayed pressed against my pulse. You already read the outside, she said, her voice dropping into a raw, vulnerable note. I did. That was already too much, Ethan. She shut her eyes tight, her forehead tilting forward until it almost touched my shoulder. Please don't be nice to me right now. I don't think I have the stamina for it. That hit me in a place I didn't have armor for. I carefully reached out with my free hand, took the blue envelope, and set it on the wooden dresser beside us, completely unopened. Then, I slowly turned my right arm, so my open palm met hers. She looked down at our joined hands. So did I. We had touched before, of course. We were roommates. Our lives were full of small, accidental collisions. Shoulder bumps in the narrow kitchen while we both tried to reach the cabinet, her freezing cold feet shoving against my leg under the living room throw blanket during movie nights because she claimed socks were foot prisons. My hand resting on the small of her back for a brief second as I moved past her in the hallway. Her fingers brushing mine when she handed me a mug of coffee before dawn. But this was different. This wasn't an accident of geometry. This was a choice. Tessa, I said quietly. Look at me. She hesitated, then lifted her chin. And there it was. The thing we had both been pretending wasn't living in the apartment with us for the last year and a half. Want, fear. A ridiculous, terrifying amount of hope. 8 months of unsent words stacked on a bed between us. I don't look at you like you're only my roommate, I said, my voice completely steady now. I haven't in a very long time. Her breath caught in her throat. I took a step closer, slow enough that she could back away into the hallway if she needed to. She didn't move an inch. If I looked at you like a roommate, I continued, I wouldn't have kept that stupid 5-second video you sent me in March on a loop. The one where you were trying to assemble a Target bookshelf at 2 a.m. and spent the entire time insulting the instruction manual. Her mouth twitched at the corner, a tiny, watery break in her tension. It was a very condescending manual, Ethan. It assumed I didn't know how an Allen wrench worked. I watched it 13 times, Tess, in the middle of a desert, while my boots were full of sand and people were snoring around me. I watched you argue with a piece of Swedish particle board. Her eyes softened, the wet shine in them growing more pronounced. That's incredibly embarrassing for you. I know, I murmured. Deeply. I've accepted it. 13 times? Maybe 14. I lost count after the third week. I let my fingers slide between hers, locking our hands together properly. It was such a small, simple movement, but it nearly took the strength out of my knees. I missed you, Tess. Not the apartment. Not the fact that someone was watering the basil plant I accidentally killed before I left. You. I missed your voice. I missed the way you leave your keys in the most illogical places. I missed everything. Her fingers tightened around mine, her grip almost painful. I missed you too, she whispered. The words were small, but they filled every dark corner of the bedroom. Then, as if the reality of what she had just said caught up to her, her expression shifted. She glanced toward the stack of letters on the comforter, and she suddenly pulled her hand back out of mine, crossing her arms so the sleeves of my gray hoodie covered her hands completely. I need to explain, before you think I'm completely unhinged, she said, her defensive walls slamming back into place with terrifying speed. Tess, I'm a combat medic. My baseline standard for unhinged involves people trying to clean their ears with loaded weapons. Your standard is fine. She let out a shaky, nervous laugh. When you left, I told myself I'd just write down the things I would have texted you if the reception wasn't terrible. But then some of it started feeling too heavy for a text, too permanent. So I wrote letters. I thought I'd send them at first. Then I got terrified. Number. Of what? That you'd be sitting on a canvas cot, surrounded by sandbags and actual real-world problems, and you'd open a letter and realize your roommate back home had developed a set of highly inconvenient, high-maintenance feelings. I tried to suppress the smile growing on my face, but I failed. She pointed a covered finger at my chest. Do not look pleased with yourself, Ethan Ward. I'm not pleased, I lied. You look aggressively pleased. I am respectfully devastated. I corrected, taking another half step toward her. There's a medical difference. And that's not a real thing. It is tonight, she huffed, but the brilliant pink blush returned to her cheeks. I wanted to keep her right there, in that soft, slightly flustered space, because I had rarely seen Tessa Collins uncertain about anything unless it involved parallel parking or her own emotions. But I also knew her. If I pushed her too fast, if I demanded too much clarity before she was ready to give it, she would turn into sarcasm and smoke and retreat into her room. So, I bypassed the tension. I sat down on the edge of the navy-sheeted mattress, leaving a deliberate, generous space right beside me. Tell me one thing, I said, looking up at her. One line, from one letter. Her eyes widened. Absolutely not. One sentence. No, one word, then. Ethan, she said, her voice warning. Tess, I just confessed to watching a video of you insulting a bookshelf 14 times in a combat zone. Meet me halfway here. Give me something. She stared at me for a long, silent moment, then looked up at the white plaster ceiling as if asking the universe for divine patience. Finally, with a slow, deliberate movement, she took 3 steps forward and sat down beside me on the edge of the bed. She didn't touch me, not yet, but she was close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from her shoulder through the thick fleece of my hoodie. The old mattress dipped under her weight, and somehow, that simple physical indentation felt more profoundly intimate than any welcome home party ever could have. She reached out and picked up an envelope from the middle of the stack. The date written on the corner was May 9th. This one? She said softly, her fingers tracing the edge of the white paper. This was the night you called me at 3 in the morning my time. It was a Thursday. I remember, I said. I told you I couldn't sleep because the generator outside my tent was making a weird clicking sound. You lied, she said, her eyes still fixed on the envelope. Yeah, I lied. I know you did, she murmured, finally turning her face to look at me. Your voice always goes flat when you're trying to hide that you're exhausted. You asked me about my day, and I spent 20 minutes telling you about Mrs. Alvarez in room 12, who kept trying to set me up with her grandson, even though he lived in Phoenix, and had, according to her, a very complicated ferret situation. I let out a low laugh. She sounded very determined. She was. And you laughed. Tessa's voice dropped, losing its defensive edge entirely. You sounded like you were carrying the weight of the entire world on your back, Ethan, but you still laughed at the ferret story. After we hung up, I couldn't go back to sleep. I sat right here on this bed, and I wrote down that I wished I could climb through the telephone wire and just sit on the floor beside your cot until you finally fell asleep. My chest tightened so fast it felt like a physical blow. She looked instantly embarrassed the second the words left her mouth, as if she wanted to reach into the air and snatched them back before they reached my ears. "I wish that too," I said, my voice rough. Her gaze flicked back to mine, her dark eyes searching my face for any sign that I was just being polite. I didn't give her a chance to doubt me. I moved my right hand between us, placing it palm up on the navy comforter. It was an invitation. No demand, no pressure, just a space if she wanted to take it. After a single heartbeat, she placed her hand in mine. Her fingers were steady this time, her palm warm against mine. "You should know something before we go any further," she said, her chin lifting again. "Okay. I am remarkably bad at casual, Ethan. 2. I don't see where things go. I gathered that from the secret archive on my bed, Tess." "I'm serious," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "If we do this, whatever this is, I don't want to be your almost. I don't want to be the girl you kissed just because you came home lonely and I happened to be standing in the kitchen." I turned toward her fully, my leg shifting against hers on the mattress. You don't know that yet. You've been back for less than an hour." "I know exactly what lonely feels like, Tessa," I said, using my thumb to gently brush against her knuckles. "Lonely is a very specific type of cold. This isn't that." Her eyes searched mine, looking for the cracks in my discipline. "Then what is it?" I should have had a perfect, smooth answer ready. Something worthy of the way the lamplight caught the dark gold flecks in her irises. But my brain was tired, and all I had left was the absolute, unvarnished truth. "It's coming home," I said quietly. "And realizing I was aiming for you the whole time." Tessa's face crumpled for a fraction of a second before she caught herself, but I saw it, the impact of the words, the sudden, sharp break in her armor. She leaned closer, her breath warm against my chin. "Can I?" she whispered, her eyes dropping to my mouth. My heart slammed against my ribs once, hard and heavy. "Yes." Tessa kissed me first. It was soft, careful, almost experimental, as if she were testing whether the physical reality of me matched the version she'd been writing to for 8 months. The world didn't crack open. The apartment didn't shift. It just felt like the first correct thing that had happened to me since I boarded a transport plane in November. I lifted my left hand, my thumb settling against the warm line of her jaw, and she made a tiny, soft sound against my lips. That was when the careful part ended. She kissed me again, deeper this time, her fingers curling into the front of my stiff uniform shirt as if she were making sure I was made of bone and muscle instead of sand and promises. I pulled her closer, my arm wrapping around her waist, drawing her up against me until the gray fleece of my own hoodie was pressed against my chest. I had imagined this in weak moments, during dust storms, in the back of bumpy field ambulances, when the night was too long and her name was the only thing keeping me awake. But I hadn't imagined how hard I would shake when she finally whispered against the corner of my mouth, "You're home." "For good tonight," I murmured against her skin. "Tomorrow, I'll figure out the rest." She rested her forehead against mine, her breathing uneven. "That sounds terrifyingly reasonable. I'm trying to grow as a person, Tess. Don't overdo it." She laughed, a small, beautiful sound that vibrated against my collarbone. For a few perfect minutes, there was no deployment, no sand, no unsent letters, and no past. There was just Tessa's knees touching mine, her hand lingering at the back of my neck, and the quiet rhythm of our breathing in the amber lamplight. Then, her phone buzzed on the wooden dresser. Once, twice. She ignored it, her fingers tracing the short hair at the nape of my neck. I kissed her temple, my lips lingering against her skin. "You can check it," I said. "It might be the hospital." "I don't want to," she muttered. "If room 12 has another ferret emergency, they can wait until dawn." "Tess, that may be the most romantic thing anyone has ever said to me." She groaned, reluctantly pulling away just enough to reach her arm out toward the dresser. "Fine. But if it's the night supervisor asking me to cover a double shift, I'm telling her you're holding me hostage." But as her fingers closed around the phone and she looked at the screen, the small, relaxed smile faded from her lips. I felt the change before I saw it, the sudden, sharp return of the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers locked tight around the glass edge. "What is it?" I asked, sitting up straighter. She turned the screen slightly away from me on pure instinct, then caught herself and stopped. A text message was glowing against the black background. It was from an unknown number. "You should have told him before he came home." Tessa went completely still, her skin turning a distinct, pale shade of gray under the lamplight. My military training snapped awake, cold and sharp, bypassing my exhaustion. I reached for her hand, but her fingers found mine first, holding on with a desperate, white-knuckled grip. She wasn't hiding behind me. She was looking directly at the glass door of the hallway, her jaw set. "Ethan," she said, her voice thin, but absolutely certain. "There's one more letter I really need you to read." The plain white envelope felt entirely different from the pale blue ones. The blue paper was smooth, smelling faintly of the lavender drawer liner Tessa used to battle the musty scent of this historic Richmond apartment. This one, however, was rough at the edges, slightly wrinkled as if it had been folded, crammed into a pocket, smoothed out, and hidden away a dozen times before finding a temporary home behind my old socks. Across the front, there was no date. No small, sarcastic doodle of a burnt piece of toast or an angry cat like the others. Just my name, Ethan, written with a heavy hand that had pressed so hard the ink had bled slightly through the fibers of the paper. Tessa sat close enough that her shoulder pressed firmly into my bicep. I could feel the rhythmic, rapid tremor running through her frame. Her skin, usually a healthy olive tone from her Italian heritage, looked translucent under the low-wattage glow of the nightstand lamp. Her eyes didn't leave her phone, which lay face down between us on the comforter now, a sleek, black rectangle of modern anxiety. "Before you open that," she said, her voice dropping into that quiet, steady tone she used when she was delivering difficult lab results to a patient's family. "I need you to know, I wasn't trying to corner you. I wasn't trying to build a cage out of my own head and trap you inside it." I looked from the letter to her face, tracking the slight shadow the loose strand of hair cast across her cheekbones. "Trap me? Tess? Emotionally?" "Yes, Tessa," I sighed, the corners of my eyes crinkling despite the heavy coldness settling into my stomach. "You are currently wearing my issued clothing. You have spent the last hour letting me sit on a bed made with your own sheets, while surrounded by 30-odd handwritten testimonials of your affection. If this is a psychological trap, your bait selection is absolutely flawless. Most guys would have walked in for the lasagna alone." A small, genuine fracture appeared in her stoic expression, her upper lip twitching with the ghost of a smile. But the fear stayed deep in her eyes, dark and heavy. That sobered me instantly. The residual adrenaline from my 8 months downrange shifted, hardening into the quiet, analytical focus I used when assessing a traumatic injury. I slid my fingers through hers, feeling the coldness of her skin. "Okay," I murmured. "Tell me how to do this. Do I read it out loud, or do I read it in my head like a civilized human being?" She squeezed my hand once, hard enough to leave white marks on my knuckles. "Just read it, Ethan. Please." End. I slid my thumb under the unsealed flap of the white envelope. The paper gave way with a soft, dry rasp that sounded absurdly loud in the quiet bedroom. I pulled out the single sheet of lined notebook paper. Her handwriting at the top was neat, precise, and disciplined the nurse, who kept immaculate charts. But as the lines traveled down the page, the slant grew more aggressive, the letters larger and messier, as if the words had started behaving themselves and then completely escaped her control. "Ethan, if I'm actually brave enough to hand you this piece of paper when you get back, it means two things. First, it means you survived, which is the only thing I care about. Second, it means I failed completely at pretending everything is normal. There is something I should have told you before you boarded that transport bus in November. You had 80 pounds of gear on your back and enough psychological weight to sink a ship, so I told myself it would be selfish to add my own mess to your pile. I told myself it didn't matter. Then it started mattering every single day. Do you remember the night of your farewell party, when everyone else finally left around 2 in the morning and you fell asleep on the living room couch with your boots still on? Mara stayed behind to help me clear the empty beer bottles. She stopped by the edge of the sofa, looked at you, and then looked at me. She said, "Tess, you're in love with him. You're being ridiculous." I told her she was out of her mind. I told her we were roommates who shared a fondness for cheap tacos and bad television. And then Mara gave me that look she gives clients when they're lying about their credit score. She said, "Maybe, but he looks at you like he's trying to memorize a map of a city he's afraid he'll never see again." I stopped reading. The paper felt heavy between my thumb and forefinger. I looked up, my eyes finding the gray army cap sitting on the dresser. "Mara?" I asked, my voice flat. Tessa didn't look at me. She kept her eyes locked on her own bare knees, her toes curling inward against the wool of her loose sock. "My sister," she whispered. "The one who thinks life advice should be delivered with the subtlety of a flashbang grenade." I knew of Mara. She was 2 years older than Tessa, sold commercial real estate downtown, and possessed the terrifying confidence of a woman who had never once doubted her own internal GPS. She was loud, fiercely protective, and treated Tessa's emotional life like a fixer-upper property she had been contracted to renovate. "She sent that text?" I asked, my thumb gesturing toward the face-down phone on the bed. "The one from the unknown number?" "I don't know," Tessa muttered, her jaw tightening. "But it sounds like her. It sounds like her brand of intervention. She called me 3 days ago asking if I'd heard from your unit. I told her no, that the schedule was classified. She told me I was wasting time, that if I didn't tell you how I felt the second you walked through the door, she was going to do it for me. The combat medic in me wanted hard data. I wanted a sender identity, an IP address, a logical explanation for why someone was tracking the lights in my bedroom window from the street below. But the man in me, the one who had spent 8 months carrying around a grease-stained piece of cardboard with her name on it, knew that the most important thing in this room was the woman sitting next to me, vibrating with a decade's worth of built-up defense mechanisms. I lowered my gaze back to the wrinkled notebook paper. I laughed her off, because that's what I do when someone gets too close to the structural walls. But then, you woke up, 30 minutes later. You looked at me through the dark, your eyes all blurry from sleep, and you didn't ask about the apartment. You didn't ask about the lease or the plants. You just asked if I would be okay while you were gone. And I wanted to say no, Ethan. I wanted to tell you that I had already started counting your footsteps when you came up the stairs, that I knew the exact sound of your keys hitting the kitchen counter, that I liked the quiet, stupid routine of finding you standing by the refrigerator at midnight in those ridiculous old sweatpants, drinking orange juice straight from the carton, even though it's unhygienic, and I complained every single time. I wanted to tell you that when you hugged me goodbye at the station, I almost asked you to stay behind, but you couldn't stay. You had a job to do, and I refused to let my feelings become another piece of shrapnel you had to carry around in your pocket. So I wrote them down here instead. If you are reading this because I finally had the courage to give it to you, please understand, I don't need you to fix anything. I don't need a promise you aren't ready to make. I just need the truth. If you feel even a fraction of what I feel, please stop walking around it. I am tired of the distance. The text ended there. The bottom of the page was clean, no signature, just a sharp indentation where her pen had stopped pressed against the blue line. I lowered the letter slowly, letting it rest against my thigh. The room had gone entirely silent again, save for the low, rhythmic thrum of the window unit air conditioner. Tessa was stiff beside me, her chin tilted up in that brave, stubborn posture I loved, but her eyelashes were wet. She was waiting for the axe to fall. She was waiting for me to be the safe, predictable roommate who smiled politely and said something gentle that ultimately meant no. "You should have told me, Tess," I said. My throat felt thick, the words scraping against my teeth like dry sand. She nodded once, a rapid, jerky movement. "I know. It was a mistake. I should have burned it." "No." I turned toward her, shifting my weight so my knee pressed into her side, forcing her to look at me. I wish you had told me before I left. Because if I had known this was waiting for me, I wouldn't have spent 8 months telling myself that missing you was just me being homesick." Her dark eyes lifted, tracking my face with a sudden, sharp intensity. "I spent half the deployment convincing myself that I was just lonely," I said, my voice rising slightly, losing its careful military cadence. Every time I'd get a message from my sister or my old high school buddies, I'd read it, reply, and put the phone away. But when a notification from you came through, I'd carry that damn phone around in my pocket all day, like a high school kid with a secret. I told myself it was just because we shared an apartment. I told myself I was being pathetic. "You never said anything in the emails," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You kept them so brief. Weather is hot. Food is gray. Hope the hospital isn't killing you." It was like reading a weather report from a very polite stranger. Because I thought it would be selfish, I let out a short, rough laugh, the irony of it hitting me square in the chest. "Look at us. 2 absolute, decorated morons." "Speak for yourself," she muttered, a single tear finally escaping her eye and tracking down the slope of her nose. "I have a bachelor's degree in nursing. I am legally considered intelligent, and I have a commendation medal for casualty care. But I spent a semester's worth of time watching a video of you losing a fight with an IKEA hex wrench." I reached up, my thumb catching the wet trail on her cheek, my skin rough against hers. We're both idiots, Tess. The tension didn't vanish, it just changed shape. It turned from the sharp, hostile dread of a misunderstanding into the heavy, breathless pause that happens right before you step off a ledge into deep water. I don't want almost either, Tessa, I said quietly, my hand lingering on her cheek, my thumb resting over her jawbone. I don't know what my schedule is going to look like next month. I don't know how long it's going to take my brain to stop waking up at 4 in the morning to scan the ceiling fan for movement. I'm a mess right now, but I know I want you. Not as a temporary arrangement, not because I just got off a plane and I'm confused. You. She stared at me, her chest rising and falling rapidly under the gray cotton of the hoodie. Then, she leaned her head into my palm, her eyelids fluttering shut as she let out a long, shuddering breath. I want you too, Ethan. That's what I want. I want you too, Ethan, she whispered into the quiet room. Even if you still drink out of the carton like a feral animal, I can change, Tess. I can learn to use a glass. Don't lie to me this early in the relationship, she murmured, a small, beautiful smile finally breaking through her exhaustion. Relationship? I repeated, holding perfectly still, my heart doing that dangerous, light-footed double tap against my ribs. Is that what we're calling it? She opened her eyes, the amber light reflecting in her dark irises. Her chin went up, brave again. Yes, if you're ready for it. The last remnants of my old sterile walls, the ones built after my ring, was mailed back to me in a bubble-wrapped envelope, simply unclenched and fell away into the dust. Yeah, I said, my voice dropping. I'm ready. I leaned in and kissed her again, but this time the hesitation was gone. It wasn't an interrogation or a question. It was a certainty. Her hands slid up the front of my desert-patterned shirt, her fingers tangling in the collar, pulling me down until her knees shifted against my thigh. The letters on the bed crinkled beneath us, a chorus of paper voices that we were finally ignoring. She pulled back just 2 inches, her lips wet, her breath hitching. We are currently sitting on 8 months of my documented emotional instability, she murmured against my mouth. I'm honored by the real estate, I whispered back, my hand settling at her waist, feeling the firm, warm reality of her beneath the oversized fabric. You should be deeply alarmed. I contain multitudes. Ethan. She laughed into the hollow of my neck, her forehead resting against my collarbone, and I just held her there for a while. The unknown text didn't matter. Mara didn't matter. The 19 days of early leave didn't matter. There was only the weight of her body against mine and the faint, sweet scent of her hair. Then, her phone buzzed again on the dresser. Buzz. Buzz. The sound was sharp, abrasive, cutting through the low lamplight like a razor blade. Tessa didn't move, her fingers remaining tightly curled into my shirt. Ignore it, she muttered into my chest. Tess, it's been 3 times now. I don't care. If it's my sister, she can wait until I've had 40 minutes of sleep. If it's a serial killer, they'll have to respect my union-mandated break. I smiled, kissing the crown of her head where the blue pen was still holding her hair together. Go look, Tess. Let's clear the board so we can actually eat that frozen brick in the kitchen. With a dramatic, theatrical sigh that told me she was finally returning to her usual sharp-tongued self, she slid off the bed. Her loose sock finally gave up the ghost and came entirely off her foot, left abandoned on the navy comforter. She walked over to the wooden dresser, picked up the phone, and flipped it over. The glow from the screen caught the sudden, sharp drop of her mouth. Ethan, she said. Her voice didn't shake this time, it went entirely cold, the playful warmth from 5 seconds ago vanishing instantly. I was off the bed before she could finish the syllable. I stood behind her, my chest pressed against her shoulder blade as I looked down at the screen. It was another image from the same unknown number. The photo was high resolution, taken from across the street. It showed our apartment building's brick facade, 3rd floor. My bedroom window was clearly visible, the small amber lamp casting her silhouette against the white blinds. Below the photograph, a single line of text waited. Tell Ethan to look in the bottom drawer. My eyes didn't leave the screen for 3 full seconds. In the theater of military medicine, there is a specific cognitive delay that happens when a stable environment suddenly betrays you. You look at a monitor, you look at a gauge, you look at a patch of skin, and for a microsecond, your brain attempts to interpret the anomaly as a glitch rather than a threat. But this wasn't a glitch. The brick patterns on the exterior wall of our building were perfectly clear. The specific slant of the window screen I had fixed with a butter knife in 2024 was unmistakable. And there, trapped behind the thin white slats of the blinds, was the soft, warm, amber blur of my nightstand lamp. Someone was standing under the streetlights on Monument Avenue, right now, looking up into the private country we had just spent the last 40 minutes building on the edge of my mattress. "Ethan," Tessa whispered again. Her hand was cold now, the fingers sliding down from my sleeve until they hooked into the fabric of my pocket. She wasn't looking at the screen anymore. She was looking at the small wooden dresser against the wall. The dresser was an old, heavy oak piece we'd found abandoned near a dumpster on Carey Street during our second month as roommates. It had 6 drawers, each one slightly warped from Richmond's relentless summer humidity. The bottom drawer was mine, technically. It was the graveyard of my domestic past. It was where I threw old field manuals, spare brass uniform buttons, a pair of running shoes with holes in the soles, and a collection of thick wool socks the Army had issued me during a winter rotation in Kentucky that I had vowed never to wear again. "I don't know what's in there," she said, her voice dropping into a flat, defensive register that I recognized from her worst 12-hour shifts at the ER. "I haven't opened your bottom drawer, Ethan. I swear to God. I only dusted the top." "I know," I said, my voice completely level. The exhaustion that had been dragging at my eyelids since my layover in Germany had vanished, replaced by the familiar, sterile chill of operational focus. "I know you didn't, Tess." I stepped away from her, my ruined combat boots making a slight, dry scuff on the floorboards as I moved toward the dresser. "Wait," she said, her voice sharp enough to stop me in my tracks. I looked back. Tessa had pulled her arms out of the sleeves of the gray hoodie, her bare hands coming up to cover her ribs. She took 2 steps forward, rising slightly on her toes, and pressed her mouth against mine. It wasn't the soft, trembling kiss from 10 minutes ago, and it wasn't the desperate, validation-seeking kiss from the bed. It was firm, heavy, and deliberate. It felt like a claim. It felt like an anchor dropped into a fast-moving current. When she lowered her heels back to the floor, her dark eyes were wide and filled with a sharp, clear light. "Whatever is about to happen," she said, her breath hitting my collarbone. "Whatever stupid text or old ghost is in this apartment, we do not let it steal what we just said on that bed. Promise me, Ethan." I reached out, my fingers wrapping around the side of her neck, my thumb resting over her jaw. "No chance, Tess. I'm home for good. I'm not going back to the desert, and I'm sure as hell not going back to being just your roommate." "Good," she whispered, though her chest was still hovering near a state of panic. "Because if you turn into a noble soldier and try to protect me by being mysterious, I am going to throw your coffee maker out the window. That would be a tragedy for both of us," I murmured. Together, hand in hand, we leaned down toward the bottom oak drawer. The brass handle was cold and loose, rattling slightly in its housing as I pulled. The wood resisted for a second, swollen from the July dampness, before giving way with a long, hollow groan that echoed through the quiet bedroom. Inside, sitting directly on top of a pair of rolled-up green wool socks, was a cardboard box I didn't recognize. It wasn't military issue. It was a standard women's shoebox, the white cardboard lid slightly yellowed at the corners. Tied around the center of it was a thin, crooked red ribbon, the kind people save from Christmas gift bags and store in a kitchen junk drawer. Stuck to the very center of the lid was a single, square, neon pink sticky note. Written on the note, in Tessa's unmistakable, slanted handwriting, were 6 words, "For when he comes home." Tessa made a small, strangled sound in her throat, a perfect hybrid of a gasp and a groan. She immediately dropped her face into her hands, the ink pen holding her hair together, shifting slightly as she shook her head. I stared at the box, then looked up at her through my eyelashes. "Please tell me this isn't an improvised explosive device, Collins." "It's worse," her voice came out muffled through her fingers. "Worse than a bomb? It's sentimental," she muttered, her shoulders sagging. "It's deeply, mortifyingly sentimental, Ethan. I'm going to die right here on your rug. Just leave me. Save yourself." I let out a low, dry laugh that bounced off the interior of the wooden drawer. "You hid sentimental contraband in my sock drawer?" "Tess, that's a direct violation of roommate territory laws." "I was going to move it," she whined, finally lowering her hands. Her face flushed a brilliant, spectacular shade of crimson that reached all the way to the collar of the gray hoodie. "I told you, I thought I had 19 more days. I was going to set it on the kitchen counter with a very casual note on Tuesday morning. I had a whole strategy." "You keep using that word strategy like I didn't just catch you committing emotional burglary in my bedroom," I said, reaching into the drawer and lifting the box. It was light, rattling slightly with the sound of small, loose objects. Do I get to open it? I asked, looking at her directly. She bit her lower lip so hard it went white. Yes, but if you laugh even a little bit, even an ironical medic smirk, I am legally changing my name and moving to a country with no extradition treaty. I'll miss you terribly in Canada, I said, my fingers catching the edge of the red ribbon. I was thinking Portugal, she shot back, her defensive wit flaring up like a shield. The weather is better for my allergies. Ambitious, I murmured. I pulled the red ribbon free. It fell away onto the navy sheets like an old piece of string. I lifted the white cardboard lid. Inside the box was a meticulous, chaotic little museum of my absence. It wasn't expensive, and it wasn't grand, but as my eyes moved over the contents, the air in my lungs went perfectly still. Sitting at the top was a single foil packet of my favorite dark roast instant coffee, the expensive local brand from the shop down the street that I always complained about buying, but drank exclusively before my long shifts. Next to it lay a small, heavy plastic keychain, shaped like a cartoon ambulance with a tiny, ridiculous smiley face painted on the windshield. Beneath the keychain was a photograph. It was from last Christmas Eve, the night I had shown up in jeans, while her entire family looked like they were attending a charity gala. In the photo, I was standing in our narrow kitchen, holding a pie crust that was burnt so black it looked like a volcanic rock, and Tessa was standing right beside me, her head thrown back, her eyes closed, laughing so hard her shoulder was blurry from the movement. I had forgotten that photo existed. I had forgotten that anyone had been looking at us when we were that happy. At the bottom of the box lay a long-lined piece of paper titled, "Things Ethan has to eat when he stops pretending field rations are fine." The list was extensive, starting with the pork belly tacos from the truck on Broad Street and ending with a highly specific note about a bakery that made croissants that did not taste like cardboard. And tucked into the very corner of the box were two rectangular paper tickets. They were for a Richmond Flying Squirrels minor league baseball game, dated for next Friday night. I picked up the tickets, the heavy cardstock crisp between my fingers. "You hate baseball, Tess." "I don't hate baseball," she said immediately, her voice dropping into a small, vulnerable register as she watched my face. "I hate 9 innings of grown men adjusting their leather gloves and spitting into the dirt. It's a public health concern. It's an essential part of the game's pacing," I countered softly, my thumb running over the date on the ticket. "You bought these for me?" "For us," she corrected, her voice trembling just enough that she had to swallow hard to clear it. "If you wanted to go," I thought a minor league game would be the safest option for a first date. It's loud enough that we wouldn't have to fill every silence if things felt weird between us. The lighting is terrible, so if my face did anything embarrassing, you wouldn't notice. And they sell those ridiculous giant hot dogs you like. I looked from the baseball tickets to her face. The gray hoodie looked even bigger on her now, her hands completely hidden inside the sleeves. "You planned a date, Tessa." "I planned a welcome-home outing with strong romantic undertones," she clarified, her chin lifting in that familiar, defensive tilt. "That's the definition of a date, Tess." Fine. She crossed her arms over her chest, the fabric crinkling. "I planned a date. Are you going to court-martial me, or are you going to answer the question?" The sheer honesty of the box, the little collection of things she had saved while I was 5,000 miles away, living in a world of dust and gray utility, undid something deep inside my chest. This woman hadn't just waited for me to return. She had built a small, quiet space for me in her life before she even knew if I'd have the courage to ask for it. I set the tickets carefully on the top of the dresser, right beside the blue envelope. Then I stepped closer until the distance between us was entirely gone. "Tessa Collins," I said quietly, looking down into her dark, gold-flecked eyes. "Are you asking me out?" She looked terrified for one brief, fragile second. Her chest hitched as if she were about to run for the door. Then, her shoulders squared. The emergency room nurse came back, the woman who could look at a broken bone and not flinch. "Yes, Ethan Ward," she said, her voice small but entirely steady. "I am asking you to go on a baseball date with me, under the strict condition that you only explain the infield fly rule if I specifically request written clarification." "I will," I whispered. "And you will refrain from using the phrase, America's pastime, more than once per evening?" "I can't promise miracles, Tess. I'm a traditionalist." Then we'll negotiate at the stadium," she murmured, her eyes dropping to my mouth. "I like negotiating with you. I said, lifting my hands to cup her face. You like arguing with me? It, she corrected, but her eyes were softening, the wetness in them, catching the amber light. Same thing, I whispered, but with better eye contact. I leaned down and kissed her, and this time, the shoebox on the dresser felt like the final piece of evidence we needed to stop pretending. Her lips parted instantly against mine, her hands sliding around my waist beneath my stiff uniform jacket, her fingers digging into the small of my back as if she were anchoring herself to the solid weight of my return. I pulled her against me until our heartbeats were perfectly synced, a frantic, heavy rhythm that had nothing to do with the army and everything to do with the 19 days of stolen time we had just been handed. Then, my pocket buzzed. Not her phone on the bed. Mine. The heavy, olive-drab tactical case I kept my phone in gave a long, violent vibration against my hip. We broke apart slowly, our lips lingering for a fraction of a second before the real world reasserted itself. I pulled the phone from my pocket, my fingers leaving a faint smudge of desert dust on the dark screen. It was an unknown number, the exact same digital line that had texted Tessa 3 minutes ago. A single message waited on the screen. Ask her why she never sent the letter about Mara. The warmth that had been filling the small bedroom seemed to leave through the floorboards, replaced by that cold, flat draft from the hallway vent. I looked from the screen to Tessa's face. She had seen the text over my shoulder. The brilliant pink flush on her cheeks vanished, leaving her look pale, her mouth setting into a thin, complicated line. She rubbed a bare hand over her forehead, her fingers accidentally knocking the blue ink pen loose. Her dark hair tumbled down around her shoulders in a heavy, disorganized wave. There's a letter about Mara? I asked gently, keeping my hands at my sides. She nodded once, looking toward the window blinds. Yes. Is it bad, Tess? No. She let out a long, shaky breath that sounded like a sigh. It's just complicated. It's the reason we're standing here like this. And it's the reason my sister is currently acting like a character in a bad CBS drama. I looked at the black phone screen, then flipped it face down on the dresser next to her device. No more messages for 5 minutes, I said, taking her hands back into mine. Ethan, someone is outside taking pictures of our window, she whispered, her fingers shaking against my palms. I know, I said, stepping closer until our socks nearly touched on the old rug. And whoever is doing it wants us to run around this apartment by our coattails because we're afraid. I've spent 8 months letting fear dictate my rotation schedule, Tess. I'm not giving them the next 5 minutes of my life. I'm giving those 5 minutes to you. Her eyes searched mine, her pupils dilated in the dim light. What are you giving me instead? The truth, I murmured, and possibly a very high level of cold lasagna, if it still exists in the kitchen. It exists, she said, a tiny, fragile smile returning to the corner of her mouth. It's currently sitting on the counter, near the toaster. Then I'm offering you romance at a very elite culinary level, Collins. Date 0 starts in the kitchen. We left the letters on the bed. We left the 2 phones face down on the wooden dresser, their screens dark and silent. Walking into the kitchen felt like stepping out of an interrogation room. The low fluorescent bulb over the sink hummed with a faint, comforting electronic buzz. The room smelled of old coffee grounds and the generic dish soap Tessa always bought because it was 90 cents cheaper than the brand name. On the counter, beside our dented metal toaster, sat the large rectangular tray of lasagna, its plastic film top still pristine. Tessa picked up a fork from the drying rack and stabbed 3 violent vent holes into the plastic. We're eating out of the tray, she announced, her tone returning to its familiar, authoritative ER register. Classy. And I expect nothing less from an executive dating experience, I said, leaning my hips against the laminate counter, watching the way the gray hoodie swallowed her frame as she opened the microwave door. What are the rules for date 0? You get plates after the 3rd date, she said, setting the timer for 4 minutes. And after the 2nd date, I let you choose the movie without vetoing it based on the potential for emotional damage. That's a huge concession for you, Tess. You vetoed a documentary about penguins last year because you said the ice looked depressing. The penguins were struggling, Ethan. It was a stressful narrative arc. The microwave hummed to life, its yellow light casting a rotating pattern across her face as she turned back to me. The teasing tone dropped away from her voice, leaving her looking smaller, softer, against the white cabinets. You know you're going to keep staring at me in that hoodie, right? Possession is 9/10 of roommate law, Tess, I murmured, my voice dropping an octave as I took 2 slow steps toward her until the tips of my boots were touching her bare foot. But relationship law might have a different loophole. Relationship. She repeated the word softly, her eyes tracking the movement of my jaw. There it is again. It feels strange, saying it in this kitchen. Does it feel bad? No. She took a shallow breath, her fingers reaching up to trace the frayed edge of my uniform collar. It feels like something I wanted when you were 7 time zones away, and all I had was a 20-second video call that cut out every time a truck drove past your tent. I wanted it too, I said, my hands finding her waist under the thick cotton. I'm scared, Ethan, she whispered, her forehead leaning forward until it pressed into the center of my chest, right over my name tape. I'm a nurse. I deal with blood and broken ribs every day, and I don't blink. But sitting in that room with those letters, I felt like I was stripped bare. I wrapped my arms around her, pulling her into the solid weight of my frame, my chin resting on the top of her dark hair. I'm scared too, Tess. You don't look it, but I have exactly one face for most high-stakes emotions. My sister calls it my mildly constipated soldier face. She let out a muffled laugh against my shirt. It is a bit rigid. It's a functional face for combat, Tess. It implies authority. It implies you need fiber, she murmured, her arms coming around my back, holding on with a quiet, desperate strength that told me the text messages were still lingering at the edge of her thoughts. We stood there in the narrow kitchen while the microwave counted down from 2 minutes, the yellow numbers flashing against the white laminate. The apartment felt smaller now, not because it was crowded, but because the space between us had finally been cleared of 18 months of careful geometry. The letter about Mara, she said after a long silence, her voice muffled against my chest. It isn't some dark structural secret, Ethan. It's just, Mara knew I was in love with you before I did. We had a massive fight about it the night before your unit deployed. I stayed still, my hand running down the long wave of her hair. What did you fight about? She called me a coward, Tessa whispered, her fingers curling tighter into my shirt fabric. She said if I let you go to a combat zone without telling you that someone was waiting for you here, I was going to spend the next year regretting it. I told her that you didn't need the pressure. I told her that a soldier shouldn't have to carry a roommate's heavy feelings into a bunker. And she told me I was making decisions for you because I was terrified of being rejected. I kissed the top of her head, the scent of her hair familiar and clean. Older sisters are medically known to be highly annoying, Tess, but occasionally they're correct. Ask, 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 Tess, ask, 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 ask. She's going to be insufferable when she finds out you said that, Tessa groaned, pulling her face back to look at me. But this text, this photo from the street, it doesn't feel like her. Mara is dramatic, but she doesn't do psychological thriller bits at midnight. She would have just kicked the door down and yelled at us. Before I could answer, the heavy, metallic intercom buzzer by the front door let out a single, long, harsh rattle that cut through the kitchen hum like a chainsaw. We both froze. The microwave gave a soft beep as the timer hit 0, leaving the kitchen in an abrupt, heavy silence. Through the doorway, in the dark living room, my phone on the dresser lit up again, its screen casting a sharp green rectangle onto the bedroom ceiling. I didn't wait for her permission this time. I walked back into the bedroom, picked up the tactical case, and flipped it over. The unknown number had sent another text. Come downstairs alone, Ethan. Or she finds out what Mara really did. I looked at the message, then looked at Tessa, who was standing in the bedroom doorway, her dark hair wild and her posture stiff with defense. No, she said immediately, her eyes narrowing. You have that face again. The mildly constipated one? The noble one, she shot back, her voice rising in tone. The one where you decide to do something stupid and military to save the day. I'm not staying up here while you walk into a dark alley because a text message told you to. I flipped the phone face down on the dresser again. I'm not going alone, Tess. Her chin lifted, that fierce, brilliant nurse coming back to the front lines. Good. Because if you had tried to leave me in this room, I was going to follow you down the stairs with a tactical weapon. What weapon? The lasagna fork? She said, her mouth setting into a hard line. It's very sharp, Ethan. I've been using it to poke holes in plastic. Look, I reached out, my fingers locking firmly with hers, our hands forming a tight, unyielding knot between us. Let's go look at our ghost together. We bypassed the elevator, an old operational habit of mine that she had adopted after living with me for a year, and took the concrete fire stairs. The stairwell was cold, smelling of damp dust and old paint, our footsteps echoing off the metal railings as we descended toward the lobby. Tessa stayed right beside me, her shoulder rubbing against mine with every turn of the landing, still wearing the oversized gray hoodie and her single remaining wool sock. When we reached the ground floor, the small glass-walled lobby was dark, illuminated only by the orange streetlights from the avenue outside. Rain had started falling again, a light, greasy summer drizzle that smeared the yellow headlight reflections across the asphalt. Standing right outside the glass entry door, her arms raised with her palms flat against the pane, was a woman. Tessa stopped on the bottom step, her grip on my hand tightening until her nails dug into my skin. Mara. Tessa Collins looked exactly like an operational commander whose mission had suffered a catastrophic failure in the third phase. Her dark hair was pulled into a crooked, loose ponytail that had shifted entirely to the left side of her neck. Her beige trench coat was buttoned into the wrong holes, leaving the hem sagging near her left knee, and she was clutching a thick, brown manila envelope against her chest, like an infantryman holding a rifle. Tessa yanked the heavy glass security door open with her free hand. "Are you completely out of your mind?" she yelled, into the damp night air. Mara winced, her eyes flicking from Tessa's angry face to my uniform, then down to our joined hands. "That depends entirely," Mara said, her voice cracking with exhaustion, "on how much of those texts you actually understood. The texts from the unknown number?" Tessa stepped forward, her voice rising an octave. "The photos of my bedroom window? The threats about what you really did?" "Mara, you looked like a serial killer with a real estate license." "I panicked," Mara said defensively, her hands dropping from the glass as she took a shaky step into the small lobby. "I've been sitting in my car for 2 hours, Tess. My phone died around 11, and I had to use the texting app on my tablet, and the interface is designed for teenagers. I couldn't get the formatting right." I stared at her, the analytical medic brain attempting to assemble the logistics. "Why the unknown number, Mara?" "Because she blocked my regular line 3 days ago after I told her she was being a coward," Mara shouted, gesturing toward her sister with the manila envelope. Tessa covered her face with her left hand, a long, miserable groan escaping her lips. "I cannot believe we share 50% of our DNA. I'm going to request a genetic audit from VCU Health tomorrow morning." Mara looked at me properly then, her expression softening into something genuinely miserable and exhausted. "You must be Ethan. I'm sorry. I really am sorry. This went entirely off the rails." "I am extremely confused, Mara," I said, keeping my arm around Tessa's waist as she hit her limit of familial embarrassment. "The text said you did something." "What did you do?" Mara exhaled a long, shaky breath that smelled faintly of diet soda and held out the thick brown envelope toward me. 8 months ago," Mara whispered, looking down at her own flats. "The day after your deployment bus left, I came over to help Tess move some boxes. She was a total wreck, Ethan. She was walking around this apartment like a ghost, looking at your empty boots in the closet, and I found the May letter on her desk. Enter inside, I DM lie. She'd already written it ahead of time. Tessa's hand dropped from her face, her eyes flashing with a sudden, dangerous fury. "You stole my mail, Mara?" "I didn't steal it. I copied the APO address from the kitchen calendar, and I mailed it to your unit in North Africa," Mara cried, her voice echoing off the concrete walls of the lobby. I thought if he knew, if he had something real to read while he was out there in the sand, he'd say something. "I thought I was helping you stop torturing yourself." The yard of the Sarn was perfectly still. The sound of the summer rain hitting the glass door was the only thing left between us. "It got returned 2 weeks ago," Mara said softly, her fingers tracing the red stamp on the front of the brown envelope. "Your unit address changed when your battalion shifted toward the coast. The Army sent it back to my office. I was going to tell you tonight. But then I drove past the building and I saw Ethan's truck in the alley. And then I saw your bedroom light go on. So you decided a psychological thriller was the correct logistical solution? I asked, my voice dry. I thought, Mara muttered, her face turning pink. I thought if I text you from a weird number, it would force you both to be completely honest with each other before I walked through the door and confessed my crime. I didn't want you to have the roommate conversation. I wanted you to have the real conversation. Tessa stared at her sister for 5 long seconds, her fingers locked so tight in mine I could feel her pulse through the skin. You were wrong, Mara, she said, her voice dropping into a cold, heavy register that left no room for negotiation. You were wrong in multiple fonts and a very large text size. That wasn't your choice to make. I know, Mara whispered, her eyes filling with real, watery regret. I'm sorry, Tess. I really am. Slot of godded mine down. Tessa looked up at me, her eyes tracking the line of my jaw, looking for the soldier face. I didn't give it to her. I just gave her a small nod, letting her know that this territory belonged entirely to her. If you ever use a third-party texting app on me again, Tessa told her sister, her voice softening just a fraction, I am going to put you into a group chat with every single hospital administrator and chief of medicine I know. They will text you about budget cuts and colonoscopy schedules until your tablet explodes. That's a fair sentence, Mara muttered, dropping the brown envelope into Tessa's hand. Can I go home now? It's raining and my coat is ruined. Go home, Mara, Tessa said. And call me when you hit the highway. We watched her turn and jog back through the glass door, her crooked ponytail bouncing against her shoulder as she disappeared into the yellow blur of the street lamps. Tessa and I stood in the dark lobby for another minute, the brown manila envelope heavy between our fingers. The historic apartment building felt different now. The mystery hadn't vanished, but it had shrunk from a large, terrifying shadow into just a standard family mess that we were going to have to clean up together on Wednesday morning. So, I said, nudging her shoulder with mine as we turned back toward the fire stairs. Date Zero reached its third act rather quickly. Tessa let out a short, clean laugh that filled the concrete stairwell like lights coming on. She's insufferable, Ethan. She's an older sister, Tess. It's a recognized medical condition. When we reached the third-floor landing and walked back into apartment 4B, the kitchen still smelled of the burnt lasagna film, and the microwave screen was still flashing its 4 zeros. But as we stepped into my bedroom to put the white shoebox away, Tessa stopped by the edge of the wooden dresser. Her foot, the one with the wool sock, had kicked against the bottom baseboard of the oak cabinet. There, jammed into the small, dusty gap between the back of the dresser and the plaster wall, was a piece of paper that hadn't been in the box. It was a white sheet, wrinkled and folded into a tight, sharp triangle, the way high school kids fold notes before passing them across an aisle. Across the front of the triangle, in faded blue ink, were 2 words. About Mara. Tessa went completely still, her fingers loosening around the manila envelope. Oh my God, she whispered, her eyes tracking the dusty white paper. I forgot about that one. The dust behind the oak dresser was a historical archive of its own, a fine, gray powder, native only to century-old Richmond apartments with floorboards that groaned whenever the barometric pressure shifted. I dropped to one knee, the stiff, desert-worn fabric of my trousers resisting the movement with a dry, rhythmic scrape. My fingers reached into the narrow gap, the tips brushing against the cool plaster wall before hooking the edge of the tightly folded white triangle. It was heavy, cheaper paper, the kind lined with thin blue bars that high school students used for midterms. It had been folded with that aggressive, fingernail-creased precision meant to survive being slipped through a locker vents or passed hand-to-hand under a desk while a teacher's back was turned. Tessa didn't reach for it. She stood with her arms crossed inside the gray fleece of my hoodie, her weight shifted back onto her single-socked heel. Her dark hair, now completely free of the blue pen, hung down over her shoulders in a heavy, chaotic curtain that hid the profile of her face from the amber light. I threw that one away, she whispered into the quiet of the room. Her voice was flat, devoid of the sharp, defensive wit she'd used as a shield all night. I mean it, Ethan. I remember the exact night I wrote it. It was 2 weeks after you left. I spent an hour trying to cram it down the gap behind the backing board, because the trash can felt too vulnerable. If the landlord came in to fix the radiator, I didn't want him finding it. I smoothed out the first crease with my thumb, the paper releasing a small, dry puff of lint. Why didn't you want anyone finding it, Tess? Because that one isn't about me being lonely, she said, her eyes tracking the movement of my hands with a strange, heavy stillness. That one is about the exact moment I realized I had already let the distance win. I didn't answer. I sat back on the edge of the mattress, leaving the paper flat against my thigh. The narrow rectangular tray of lasagna was still sitting on the kitchen counter 3 rooms away, cooling down from molten plastic into a solid, red brick of domestic failure. But neither of us cared. The small apartment felt entirely compressed now, the air thick with the residue of 8 months of calculated silence and her sister's midnight real estate operation. I unfolded the second crease. Her handwriting inside wasn't like the others. It wasn't the disciplined, immaculate script of a nurse who spent 12 hours a day charting vitals. It was frantic, the blue ink digging deep enough into the page to leave raised white ridges on the reverse side. Ethan, Mara came over again today. She brought 3 boxes of those high-protein fiber bars you like, the ones that taste like sweetened gravel, and left them on the kitchen island. She didn't say anything for 20 minutes. She just walked around the living room, picking up your old coffee mugs from the side table, checking the soil in the basil plant, and looking at the empty space by the door where your boots used to sit. Then she sat on the stool across from me while I was trying to clean the grease filter under the microwave. She didn't use her real estate voice. She used her, "You're making a structural mistake" voice. She said, "Tess, you need to understand something about men like Ethan Ward. They don't ask for room because they've been trained to occupy exactly 6 square feet of canvas. If you don't build a proper doorway for them, they'll just stand on the porch until the frost kills the grass." I told her to leave. I told her she was projecting her own bad divorces onto a perfectly functional roommate agreement. But after she locked the door behind her, I went into your room. I sat on your bare mattress, the one that still smelled like that cheap cedar shoe spray you use, and I realized she was right. I had spent 6 months being safe, because safe is what keeps you from having to explain why you're crying over a 5-second video call. Mara told me that before you left, you asked her for my insurance policy details. Not the military paperwork, my actual VCU health employee coverage. She said you spent 10 minutes in the driveway, making her promise that if the roof leaked or if my car broke down on the bridge at 2 in the morning, she wouldn't let me handle it alone. You told her I was terrible at asking for help because my pride has an attitude problem. Why did you do that, Ethan? Why did you look after me from 5,000 miles away while pretending you were just a guy who paid half the electric bill on the first of the month? If you wanted me to stay your roommate, you shouldn't have left your ghost in every corner of this kitchen. I stopped reading. My thumb stayed pressed against the corner of the page, right over the word ghost. The micro-tension that had been lingering in the room since Mara walked out the door shifted, dropping away into a quiet that felt heavy, almost clinical. I looked at Tessa. She had moved closer to the bed, her bare toes poking out from under the hem of the hoodie, her eyes fixed on the wrinkled white triangle of paper. "I didn't think she'd tell you that," she said, her voice dropping into a small, dry whisper. "About the insurance, or the driveway." "I was a medic, Tess," I said, my voice completely steady as I folded the note back into its sharp triangle. "If I don't check the evacuation route before the storm hits, I'm not doing my job. You were my evacuation route. The whole damn time I was downrange, this apartment was the only coordinate that didn't change on the map." "That's a very functional way to describe an attachment, Ethan," she murmured, a tiny, watery break appearing in her stoic expression. "It's the only way I knew how to say it without running out of air," I said, reaching out to take her wrist. Her skin was warmer now, the residual heat from the kitchen microwave still lingering on her fingers. I pulled her down beside me on the mattress, not fast, leaving her enough space to resist if she wanted to keep the roommate walls up. She didn't resist. She let her weight drop against my side, her head coming down to rest against the stiff fabric of my shoulder epaulette. The red ribbon from the shoebox was still tangled near our boots on the rug, a bright, anomalous stroke of color against the dark floorboards. "We look ridiculous," she said, her voice muffled by my collar. "1 sock, a stolen hoodie, a box of instant coffee on the dresser. This isn't how people start things." This is exactly how people start things, when they've spent 8 months pretending they're made of stone, Tess," I muttered, my chin resting against her hair. "We're just clearing the inventory. It takes time. Mara's going to call in 20 minutes. She sighed, her fingers tracing the row of plastic buttons on my uniform sleeve. "She's probably already at the intersection of Broad and Boulevard, drafting a group text to our mother about how she single-handedly saved my romantic prospects." "Let her text," I said. "Our phones are face down." They don't exist until Wednesday morning. The quiet returned, but it wasn't the hostile, defensive quiet from before. It was the slow, rhythmic pause of two people who had finally stopped scanning the horizon for mortar fire and realized the ground beneath them was solid. I closed my eyes, letting my chin sink further into her dark wave of hair, my heart learning the shape of her breathing against my ribs. Then, through the thin, white slats of the blinds, a sharp flash of white light cut across the bedroom ceiling. It wasn't lightning. The July rain outside was too steady, too gray for a summer storm. It was a rhythmic, calculated double tap of high beams from the street below. Two short, bright bursts of halogen light that illuminated the dust motes floating over my dresser before dying back into the amber dark. Tessa went perfectly rigid against my side. Her hand stopped moving on my sleeve. "Ethan," she whispered, her eyes tracking the dark ceiling where the white reflection had just been. "Mara's car has yellow fog lights. Those were white." I didn't answer. I rose from the bed, my boots making no sound on the rug, as I drifted toward the window. My hand reached out, my fingers catching the third slat of the white blinds, cracking them open exactly 2 millimeters, just enough to see the wet black asphalt of Monument Avenue below. A large, dark sedan was idling directly across from our entrance, its exhaust pipe releasing a low, gray plume of vapor into the drizzle. The headlights were off now, but as I watched, the driver's side window rolled down 3 inches, the glowing red ember of a cigarette illuminating the silhouette of a man's hand resting on the frame. Then, my phone, the heavy, tactical case, sitting face down on the wooden dresser, gave a short, single vibration against the oak. The glowing screen of my phone felt heavy in my hand, casting a sharp, green glare across the clean navy sheets of the mattress. I didn't look at it immediately. I looked at Tessa. Her dark eyes were fixed on the window blinds, her pupils dilated until the warm gold flecks I'd memorized over a year ago were entirely swallowed by the shadow of the room. The single wool sock she had left on the comforter sat between us like a discarded monument to the quiet reality we had spent the last hour trying to build. My thumb slid over the smooth glass of the tactical case. The preview text from the unknown number appeared in a single, blocky line. "He's been waiting since Richmond. Ask him about the keys, Tessa." A micro twist of cognitive dissonance went through my chest. The tactical medic in me, the version that had spent 8 months calculating casualty collection points under mortar fire, immediately began checking the perimeter. The large, dark sedan idling on Monument Avenue wasn't a threat. It was a delivery vehicle. The driver rolled his window down another inch, the red ember of his cigarette arcing through the July drizzle as he flicked the ash onto the wet pavement, completely oblivious to the silent, emotional standoff happening on the 3rd floor. "The keys?" I said, my voice dropping into that low, flat register that always made her stop pacing. "Tess, who has the spare, set to the alley gate?" Tessa let out a sharp, ragged breath, her shoulders sagging as the terrifying illusion of a psychological thriller collapsed into the unvarnished reality of her family's relentless interference. She dropped her forehead against the wooden frame of the closet door with a hollow, rhythmic thud. "Riley," she whispered. "My cousin Riley. He works the late shift dispatch for the city transit. I gave him my spare ring 3 months ago when my kitchen pipe burst while I was on a 12-hour rotation in the ER. I stared at her for 2 full seconds before the dry humor of the situation broke through my adrenaline, unclenching the rigid line of my jaw. "So your sister steals your handwritten correspondence? Your cousin tracks my truck from the avenue? And they're both currently conducting a synchronized midnight stakeout outside our building, like a pair of low-budget private investigators with an attitude problem? They're a collaborative ecosystem of boundary issues." "Ethan," she groaned, her voice muffled by the wood. "I am going to change my phone number, dissolve my legal status, and join a cloistered convent in New Mexico. Do not try to find me. The desert is your territory anyway. The logistics of moving you to New Mexico would require a larger duffel bag, Tess," I murmured, stepping up behind her. I wrapped my arms around her waist, pulling her back against the solid warmth of my chest. The gray fleece of my old army hoodie was soft against my palms, smelling faintly of the lavender drawer liners and 8 months of unfulfilled waiting. "Besides, your basil plant wouldn't survive the climate change. You've already structurally compromised it twice this week." She let out a small, genuine laugh against my collarbone, the frantic tremor that had been running through her ribs finally settling into a steady, predictable rhythm. The text from the unknown number didn't matter anymore. The dark sedan didn't matter. The 19 days of early leave had shrunk from an overwhelming psychological adjustment into a simple, beautiful space that belonged entirely to us. Date Zero is officially a culinary catastrophe, she whispered, turning her head until her nose brushed against the stubble on my jaw. The lasagna has reached terminal velocity in the microwave. It's a biohazard now. We're eating cereal, Collins, I said, guiding her out of the dark bedroom and into the narrow kitchen, where the low fluorescent bulb over the sink was still humming its lazy electronic tune. Standing up, barefoot, out of a single ceramic bowl because I'm a combat medic and I refuse to clean 2 dishes before my internal clock hits dawn. That's a very undisciplined approach to household operations, Ward, she said, but her hand slid into my back pocket, her fingers hooking into the denim as she watched me pour the generic cornflakes into the bowl. But I'll allow it under the Roommate Squatters' Rights Act. Relationship law, I corrected softly, setting the carton of milk on the counter and handing her a silver spoon. We signed the treaty in the hallway, remember? No backtracking. She took the spoon, her eyes softening into that deep, dark gold brilliance I'd kept on a loop inside my head while sleeping on a canvas cot surrounded by sandbags. No backtracking, she repeated. We ate the cereal in silence, sharing the bowl on the laminate counter while the July rain continued its steady, grayscale whisper against the window pane. It should have felt ridiculous standing in a ruined uniform, with 1 wool sock on the floor and 8 months of secret letters stacked on a bed 3 feet away. But as I watched her take a bite and then wipe a stray drop of milk, from the corner of her lip, I felt a profound, heavy stillness settle over my chest. It wasn't the sterile safety of a bunker or the calculated peace of a successful evacuation. It was home. A year after that night, Tessa still had the gray army hoodie. She claimed it had legally transferred ownership due to an uninterrupted 12-month period of emotional occupancy, and I didn't have the legal standing to argue. We went to that minor league baseball game next Friday night. She heckled the mascot from the third base line, asked exactly 2 highly sarcastic questions about the infield fly rule, and cried into her giant hot dog when the elderly couple on the jumbo kiss cam kissed like teenagers. Afterward, she admitted that baseball was tolerable under the correct supervision, which I counted as a historic military victory. By the following spring, we weren't roommates anymore. We were just us. Same historic Richmond apartment, different bedroom arrangement, 2 toothbrushes in the ceramic cup by the sink, and her collection of letters tied with that crooked red ribbon sitting on the center shelf of our living room bookcase, not hidden, not secret, just a quiet monument to the year we stopped walking around the edge of our own lives. And on quiet mornings like this one, when the Virginia sunlight comes through the kitchen window and Tessa stands by the stove in my old frayed hoodie making a pot of black coffee, I still get that exact same catch in my throat that I had at 11:43 on a Tuesday night. Like a man who walked into a room he wasn't supposed to see and found the rest of his life waiting for him in the dark. What would you have done if you came home 19 days early and found your roommate hiding 8 months of secret letters about you in your own bedroom? Have you ever had someone understand your quiet moments before you even knew how to name them yourself? Tell your story in the comments below. If you liked this journey with Ethan and Tessa, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next story under the awning.